Never would I imagine that during the American Revolution, a group of pacifists could face ridicule and scorn due to their beliefs. Turns out that is exactly what happened to the Quakers. I learned about the Quakers and the American Revolution. I would be surprised if anyone listening to this has at any point really thought about the Quakers in their life. Maybe the occasional thought, but I doubt it. And if you did, it's because of their commercialized version, most likely. Where they sell you oatmeal. Listen, I love that oatmeal. But you're not really thinking about the Quakers. You're thinking about Quaker oats. It's a whole different thing. To be fair to you, you knew that. The truth is, they were vital in the early days of this country. They were vital in the formation of the colonies and early America. I mean, you look at Rhode Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, those states don't develop as they do without the Quakers. And that includes our first capital, Philadelphia, where the Quakers were, at least initially, quite influential. They were pioneers of religious freedom and abolition, but they were also pacifists. Pacifists were not well liked, both in times of war and seemingly outside of war. And as a result, when the revolution came about, the Continental Congress, the colonists, and eventually the British all were at odds with the Quakers. Essentially, the Revolutionary War was a pretty dark period for the Quakers. If you don't know, the Quaker denomination began in England in the 1650s. They were pretty much disliked from the start. Historian Hilary Hines notes, at the time of their inception in the 1650s, however, the reputation was less benign. Early friends were seen by more Orthodox believers as at best misguided and at worst evil. When the best thing you could think about someone is they're pretty misguided, you don't like them and you don't think highly of them. Obviously, if you think they're evil, you don't like them. The dislike was due to the Quakers going to an extreme that most other religions didn't following the Reformation. They rejected many of the basic tenets of the Christian faith, including baptism, the Trinity, and pretty much all sacraments and ceremonies. I think if people know about the Quakers, the thing they might know is the fact that they're pretty loose in their practice. They have their ceremonies in houses and barns, and people can just speak out in the middle of the ceremony. Or at least they could. I'm not going to speak about what they do now. I haven't followed it as closely, but back in those days, you could just speak out in the middle of a ceremony. So, you're a new religion. You're not very well liked. What do you do? Well, you go to the New World, because that's where all these religions that are annoying the mainstream Protestants are going. But they didn't have any better luck when they came over to the colonies. In fact, in 1656, Boston returned two ships bearing Quakers back to their original ports solely because they were carrying Quakers, which is wild. This isn't like you drove an hour in a car and now you have to turn around because someone doesn't like you. I mean, this is crossing the Atlantic. That's insane. But since they weren't well liked, back across they went. Massachusetts actually made it illegal for the Quakers to enter the colony. The most infamous case regarding that law is the hanging of Mary Dyer, which occurred on June 1st, 1660. And Mary's only true crime was continuing to enter Massachusetts. I'm going to stop us right there and go on a bit of a side tangent, a little bit down the side road, talk about Mary Dyer. I'm assuming at least someone was questioning what they heard when they heard me say her only crime was going to Massachusetts, and really wondering if she got hanged for that. Yes, she did. Mary Dyer was a woman that at one point lived in Massachusetts. She was originally an antinomianist. I'll be honest with you. I only mentioned that because I had never heard of them. I had to look it up. They apparently have a view that Christians are freed from the demands of God's moral law. At least that's what a quick Google search said. I was loving learning about them. They were unique, and they're not a group that really ever hit my radar. So she was at first an antinomianist. She was close friends with a fellow antinomian, Anne Hutchinson. They both had given birth to children that in lore were described as monsters, and I hate to use that term, but that's what was said at the time. Some of the quotes reference horns and scales. Obviously, no. But this is what was said by the local Puritans. The Puritans were not the most accepting of people. So, along with Anne Hutchinson, Mary and her husband William first moved to establish a colony on Aquanic Island, now known as Rhode Island, which became a place of religious freedom and far more accepting of others. However, they then moved to England in the 1650s. William returned to Rhode Island shortly after arriving in England. I guess he didn't like fish and chips. Mary, however, stayed for a bit longer, which is a bit odd to me, but whatever. While in England, she converted to Quakerism. She was in England as Quakerism was emerging, so for someone clearly looking for something, the newly emerging Quakerism was perfect for her. She did eventually return to Rhode Island. However, port of entry was Boston, the same Boston that is in Massachusetts, the same Massachusetts that was banning Quakers. Uh-oh. Upon landing in Boston, Dyer was picked up along with two other Quakers, William Robinson and Marmaduke Stevenson. And I only reference their names because I feel bad for Marmaduke. There are definitely numerous Marmadukes in history, and yet I bet all anyone can think about now is the dog. So sorry, Mr. Stevenson. All three were imprisoned and then subsequently banished from Massachusetts. Dyer left for Rhode Island, where she could find her family in safety. However, in the summer of 1659, Dyer returned to Massachusetts to visit Robinson and Stevenson, who had recently been arrested with several others. You know what happened to Dyer next? She was arrested. Once again, they were all banished. The men decided to stay, but Dyer returned to Rhode Island again. She couldn't stay away. She re entered Massachusetts. In a shocking turn, she was arrested. All three were sentenced to be hanged. She got a reprieve because there was a lot of outcry. She was a woman, they didn't really want to do that, so she was free. She did have to watch her cellmates and friends be hanged, which had to be extremely tough. One last time, she returned to Rhode Island, and then baffling one last time, she returned to Massachusetts. I don't know why. I think that's part of why her story became popular. Why did she keep coming back? What was going on? I'm not going to get into the intricacies of this woman. It's actually a pretty fascinating story. If you read about her husband's begging her not to go, and she just wouldn't listen. People said she had madness. I don't think she had madness. I think people get really strong on their belief in faith, and they won't be pushed away. So she went back, and she was arrested because she admitted fully who she was and that she wasn't allowed to be there. And then she was hanged. And her only crime was being a Quaker who entered Massachusetts multiple times. But still, that's her only crime. My quick aside on the Mary Dyer story, I told it for two reasons. One, I just find it fascinating. I didn't know about it, and I love learning new things. That's the point of this whole show. Here's this woman whose only real crime was entering Massachusetts multiple times, sure, but that was it. I had never heard this. But I also told it because it's a very good example as to what was happening to Quakers. They were literally arrested for entering a colony. If you're interested in this story, the sources in my description include an article by Ann G. Miles, which goes into far more detail and is fantastic. That article was the source for my telling. Quakers clearly learned that they needed their own room. They had Rhode Island, which was known for its religious freedom. It was great for them, but they needed to expand a bit. Rhode Island wasn't big enough. Not that big of a state now. So they went to other places, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and they formed the backbone of a New Jersey development in what was called West Jersey province, literally like the west of Jersey. They were in other states, I need to be fair about that, but those were the biggest populations. Those three states played a crucial role in the American Revolution, especially Pennsylvania, since it was the home state of Philadelphia. Quakers were instrumental in the way Philadelphia developed. But before I continue, since we now know where the Quakers are living, and we have a little bit about how the world doesn't like them, let me go into the relationship with pacifism. Truthfully, the Quakers didn't come out with their official peace treaty testimony until 1660. That's when they officially declared that they would not participate in war. But it had been a part of their teachings and religion for years leading up to the testimony, and it was well known. I mean, you don't come out in 1660 and say, here's our peace testimony, and the whole congregation goes, oh my gosh, what happened? No, you knew going in. And there's some examples because their pacifist beliefs were part of a series of laws that Massachusetts started implementing that eventually led to them fully getting rid of the Quakers. And one of those laws was in Plymouth, where in 1658, they disenfranchised anyone who opposed military service. Basically, hey, Quakers, you don't want to do military service because it's against your belief, so you don't get to vote. Really makes governing against them pretty easy. Clearly, it was a well known Quaker belief and used against them pretty early on. But they had their colonies now: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, Rhode Island. They were doing okay. But then you had the French and Indian War. And that war split the Quakers into two factions: those who adhered to the policy of peace and those who would take the needed defensive measures. It's not good when your policy split your group, and you'll see that again in the American Revolution. It doesn't help things out. But really, The bigger issue is that there was a lot of resentment built up to the Quakers from others because of their refusal to fight. Historians note that pacifism cost them much of their political power in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. In the nation's capital, one of the biggest cities at the time, it cost them their political power because they wouldn't fight. I would think, in the Quakers' mind, going to war is the worst thing that could happen, and therefore, they were pretty much against the revolution. Please don't go to war, this is going to be bad for us, that type of thing. Really, they knew what was going to happen, and they knew it was going to be bad for them. There's even pamphlets out there that were covering their concerns about the revolution, because the war put them in an awkward spot. First, the Quakers had ties with England. Okay, yes, all colonies had ties with England. They were English colonies. But Quakers had some good ties between their business relationships and their personal relationships. There was still a sizable Quaker population in England. They had a lot going back and forth. But more concerning to them than their relationships was they were afraid that if England stopped governing the colonies, their persecution would get worse. Their thoughts were that England protected their charter and saved them from experiencing what they had under the Puritans. The analogy I use is that England was their tough best friend, protecting them from bullies. Now the American patriots were asking the Quakers to punch their best friend in the face. That's not a good idea. The Quakers had to take some steps. They knew that they had to do something to help themselves. Essentially, first they tried to negotiate peace between the two sides. They leveraged the fact that they had good congregation over in England to link up the two arguing groups. I don't know if I have to put a spoiler warning in here, but that obviously didn't work. They then forbade their congregations from aiding the efforts of the Patriots. Now, to be clear, they were not to impede the Patriots. They weren't going to get in their way. They weren't going to stop them. They just couldn't help them. They outright forbid anyone from participating in the war. If you're a patriot, I don't think you're loving the fact that they're not going to help you and that they're not in the war. So, the issue became a pretty big deal to them, and rather quickly. I mean, you have Thomas Paine dedicating an entire section of his appendix in Common Sense to the Quakers. In it, he actually addressed a 1776 pamphlet written by the Quakers calling for peace. He said their pacifism was a lie and not one of their truly held beliefs. He challenged them to reach out to the King of England and tell him he was committing the sin of bearing arms. Sure, that would have been easy for them to do, Mr. Paine. I just bet it was. There is no way the Quakers didn't feel Paine's influence turning people against them in the coming years. Here's one of the leading intellectual minds of the Revolution saying you're a liar. You're not willing to call out the King of England for him bearing arms? The accusations were not good. At this point, Quakers are not a well-liked group. They want peace with England for what I think are logical reasons. What happens next? Well, this is what happens. They get some not-so-great treatment. First, the colonies started using taxes and fines. See, all colonies had a law regarding military service. If one was not going to serve in the military, they must find a substitute and pay a fine. If the offender did not pay the fine, the state would seize their property. Who's that going to hurt the most? How about the whole group of people not going to war, who likely can't find replacements? But truthfully, it wasn't just the colonies using these types of taxes. Fines and seizures were also a common practice of the British. They did the exact same thing when they occupied land where Quakers lived. There are many examples from New York where the British levied taxes against any Quakers, and then when the taxes went unpaid, the British fined the Quakers and seized their properties. Another way that the Patriots worked against the Quakers was the Oath of Allegiance. The oath required citizens to swear an oath of loyalty to their state and renounce any such loyalty to England. I just told you why the Quakers were very leery of separating from England, and they believed that these oaths brought them into the conflict. And I kind of agree. You can't tell me you're not in the conflict if you're sitting there saying, I renounce my relations to you. I'm now loyal to these guys. You can't say you're not on the other team's side if you're wearing their jersey. The refusal to take the oath resulted in fines, property seizure. It also resulted in the inability to work at certain occupations like teaching. This ban would result in the shutdown of many Quaker schools. But the punishment could be worse. There were 2 patriots hanged in Philadelphia for the refusal to swear the oath. Essentially, when taxes and fines, property seizures didn't work, state governments went with much more extreme measures. Aside from hanging, a favorite measure of the colonies was exile. There were several cases in New York where the authorities exiled Quakers to British-controlled territories. But the most famous one, the one I want to talk about, is the case of exile that occurred in Philadelphia in the summer of 1777. The Continental Congress received a document claiming to have been obtained at a Quakers' yearly meeting at Spangtown, New Jersey. Yes, this is a real place. It is now Rahway. I am doing everything in my power to not make a joke right now. I'm struggling. This document listed several questions from the British to the Quakers about the current state of the Continental Army. For example, where are they? How many men? What type of weapons they have? That type of thing. Attached to the document were the responses from the Quakers to the British Army. So naturally, Congress was outraged. It did not matter that this document was a complete forgery and that no meeting took place. Congress was angry. So the Continental Congress did not hesitate to respond to the letter, and on August 28, 1777, they passed a measure to arrest the Quakers they felt responsible for the seditious act. The names they picked were entirely subjective. There was no sound reasoning ever provided. The government ended up arresting 41 Quakers. 19 were later released, but the authorities now held the remaining 22 Quakers in a Masonic lodge awaiting exile to the Virginia frontier. Which, I don't know if conspiracy theories existed then, but the local Masonic lodge and the Quakers being held for sedition, and that would be a conspiracy theorist's dream. So, the quick resolution and arrest were not born out of panic of traitors, but likely the result of a long-standing dislike and distrust of Quakers. One of the most prominent American leaders pushing for punishment was John Adams. John Adams had a long-held aversion to the Quakers. Adams, truthfully, had numerous personal clashes with the Quakers over the years, especially with one of their leaders, Isaac Pemberton. Pemberton and Adams had a couple big headbutts. Historian Adam Scherr described the impact of the 1774 confrontation between Adams and the Quakers. He wrote, in Adams' draft autobiography, written in 1804-1805, his encounter with the Quakers looms large. Rage at their lack of deference towards him incubated in his mind. Apparently, Adams never forgave Pemberton's actions. Oh, and the incident between Adams and the Quakers in 1774 is about the Quakers pressuring him to set up a meeting to talk to, or harass him if you're Adams, about Massachusetts persecuting Baptists. I wonder why they would feel a lot of empathy for the Baptists. Adams was heavily influential in the decision to punish the Quakers. He was assigned a position on the commission to determine what action Congress should take towards the imprisoned Quakers, and there's no doubt he took advantage. I'm kind of actually a John Adams fan, all things considered, but come on. The imprisonment and exile of all the prominent Quaker leaders was not because they posed a threat. It was in accordance with previous biases. Distrusted and disliked the Quakers because of their beliefs. Some patriots did use the Quakers' position on the war as an excuse for mistreatment, but the patriots' reasoning overlooks two vital facts. The first was that the Quakers had a valid reason for not wanting to separate from England. It would have been nice for the patriots to look at their history. It would have been nice for patriots to look at Quaker history and understand that maybe the Quakers had valid concerns. Look at Massachusetts. Look at how they were treated after the French and Indian War. Anyone who could look at the Quaker history and say, it would have been nice for patriots to look at the Quaker history and understand that maybe the Quakers had valid concerns. I mean, look at Massachusetts. Look how they were treated after the French and Indian War. You would hope those patriots could look at the Quaker history and say, look at what has happened. Look at what we're doing to them now. Maybe the Continental Congress could have provided some assurances of equal treatment. Maybe the Continental Congress could have provided some assurances of equal treatment. It would have been nice for patriots to look at the Quaker history and understand that maybe the Quakers had valid concerns. I mean, look at Massachusetts. Look how they were treated after the French and Indian War. You would hope those patriots could look at the Quaker history and say, look at what has happened. Look at what we're doing to them now. Maybe the Continental Congress could have provided some assurances of equal treatment in post-war America. But then again, if you're a Quaker, would you even trust them? That's a whole different debate. I mean, the revolutionary leaders led to the push to remove the Pennsylvania Charter, which upheld religious liberty and the Quakers' place. So, the anxiety regarding their protection is pretty valid. The second vital fact overlooked by patriots is that while the Quakers wanted to remain with England, they never actively assisted the British. They refused to assist the rebels, but they also refused to assist the British. They just took a sidestep outside the conflict. Everyone views that a little differently. I don't know if you can call them traitors, since they didn't really help the enemy either. To wrap things up, the Quakers' beliefs made them outsiders from the start. Their loose nature, differences in religious practice separated them from the rest of the Christian world. However, their beliefs in pacifism was what really put them at odds with both the Patriot leaders and the British military. It led to taxation, fines, property seizures, exiles, and death for the Quakers who didn't want to participate in the war. Look how happy the Continental Congress was to go along with the Quakers' punishment based on a forged letter they never verified. And again, I'm trying not to make a joke about where it's from. At the end of the day, they helped build Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and Delaware into some of the strongest states in the American Union. You have the first state in Delaware, then you have Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and they played some very important roles in those early days. Yet none of that mattered when their beliefs put them at odds with the new government. It's one of what I would call an injustice of the American Revolution. People may think differently than I do. Not everyone agrees with my views, but still, it was fascinating to learn about this. I knew of Quakers, obviously, from my time growing up around Philadelphia. I can't hide that I'm from that area when anyone hears my accent. Trust me, I would try to change it if I could. I knew who the Quakers were, and I knew about them a little bit, but I didn't know this. There's actually a lot I didn't know about Quakers, and I'll do a whole other episode about that stuff at a later time. Because the Quakers were fascinating people, and they deserve some credit for all they've done and all they've achieved, but they also deserve recognition for what they suffered for simply existing in a country with religious freedom. But the story with the Revolutionary War is the one I wanted to focus on in this episode. Thanks again for listening. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and hopefully check out my sources in the comments. Again, a lot of good stuff on this. They're always there. I encourage you to follow the historians that I use. They're great historians, and stay tuned for future videos.